Good evening. Welcome once again to the Tzemach Bible Institute program. I'm John Klein, and with me tonight, as usual, is Ken Garrison, pastor of Fellowship Church and founder of the Tzemach Bible Institute. Good evening, Ken.
Good evening, John.
Ken, are we fast approaching Armageddon? After all, Russia has invaded Georgia, and there's battles going on right now. Israel is supplying arms to Georgia and opposing Russia in this thing. So the question is, are we on the doorstep of Armageddon?
I think, John, there's a very real prospect that could be true. Obviously, not immediately, but certainly this thing could expand. Many people fear it'll expand into a regional thing, I guess it's already that. It could come into a real international thing, and who knows how it could expand out from that. Obviously, the Russians are upset with Israel, and now they're vowing to reinforce Iran more and more, and so again, the thing could blow up from where it's at. We're going to look tonight, as we have been for the past few weeks, at one of the subject areas or topics of Bible prophecy, and this issue of approaching Armageddon is one of those primary topics that we see in the Bible. We want to see if we can understand that in a very real sense. We have divided, as we have worked in the Bible Institute over the years, Bible prophecy into basically 5 basic areas, dealing with the ingathering of Israel to the land, the Messiah, God's glory in the midst of Jerusalem or Zion, and the next topic, the judgment of the nations that we're going to consider tonight. All of these dovetail into deliverance in the redemption process, leading to Messianic age and a new creation, which is the final topic that we'll ultimately discuss. But we're going to talk about the nations tonight.
Okay, so we're talking about judgment of the nations. We're not talking about individual judgment here. We know Hebrews 9:27, given the man to die once, then comes judgment. But we're not talking about that here. This is judgment of the nations.
Nations are international phenomena in the more general redemption process. Absolutely. Right. So we want to be careful.
This would occur first before individual judgment.
We want to be careful not to confuse those two things, because people often do. John, let's look at in a very general sense, why is God in the process of judging the nations?
Okay, so we're going to look first at Jeremiah 25:31. Now, at the time Jeremiah is writing this, Babylon or Nebuchadnezzar's attacking Jerusalem and carting people off. But he's talking way beyond just that what's happening in his day. Jeremiah 25:31. A clamor has come to the end of the earth, because the Lord has a controversy with the nations.
All right.
So obviously that's much broader than Babylon. So it occurred in his day, but it took on real prophetic significance for our day and the end of days.
Yeah, and we might add, we might add to that this is a persistent theme through all the prophets. So it's not just something, right. Although Jeremiah has unique responsibilities there, because God specifically calls him, and he's very unique in that regard, as a prophet to the nations.
Right.
So Jeremiah 25 is of special emphasis.
Right, in Jeremiah 1 it says, I call you as a prophet to the nations. We're going to continue in Jeremiah, in 25, we're going to look at verses 15, 16, and 29. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, says to me, take this cup of the wine of wrath from my hand, and cause all the nations to whom I send you to drink it. And they shall drink and stagger and go mad because of the sword that I will send among them. And verse 29, for behold, I am beginning to work calamity in this city, which is called by my name. And shall you completely be free from punishment? You will not be free from punishment, for I am summoning a sword against all the inhabitants of the earth, declares the Lord of hosts.
So the Lord declares that he has a controversy with all flesh, with all the nations. Actually, when you look at it from this perspective, it kind of looks like he's intent on beating up on Gentiles in general, non-Jews or non-Israelis. But the subject is much broader than that.
Well, and he starts in Jerusalem, the city he called with his name.
Absolutely. So what he says is, if you drop a pebble in a pool of water, you can see waves, concentric waves moving out from that. And this judgment is like that. He starts in the middle in Jerusalem, and the waves go out. And in fact, in Jeremiah 25, he specifically outlines that process, and also in time. And it's very, very important for us to understand that Jeremiah is not just talking about his day, he also is talking about throughout the ages. And so now the question is, why this judgment? Why is God intent on judging the nations? And we would maintain that the reason for this judgment is that the nations ultimately become a vessel, a manifestation of Satan in opposition to God's plan and purpose. The nations were originally created by God himself in the aftermath, and we're going to read about Babel and talk about Babel in a moment back in Genesis 11. But coming out of Babel, God created the nation states as we know, and so we say, well, God was responsible for them, so we couldn't call them evil. And so nations per se are not evil, but when they expand beyond their borders and form empires, and they start usurping the position of God himself.
Okay, that's exactly what Nimrod did. He formed everybody. It became a rebellious city, rebelling against God's authority. They were building a tower to God. They were going to do it on their terms. And so God judged Babel, scattered the people, changed the language, and broke them up. In other words, in unity, nothing would be impossible for them. So he scattered them, cutting down on their sin, Ken. That's the first judgment of a city that we see in the Bible, really.
That's right. I always look at it from the standpoint that God specifically intervened to limit their progress, actually. Human progress from that perspective.
Right.
Because their progress was in opposition.
Rebellion. Right.
Now, we have to consider, then it was true in Genesis 11 in Babel, and Armageddon will bring us to a repeat of the same thing. They were acting in such a way to oppose the very stated will of God. So, because God said, be fruitful, multiply, and scatter out and fill the earth. And they were building a city, we're told, in order to not be scattered.
Right. They believed in God, but on their own terms.
That's right.
They were going to get, if you remember, God specifically put cherubim guarding the tree of life, guarding the way to him. So God could come to man, but man couldn't get to God. Well, what they were doing is they were building a tower to get to God.
To get to something.
Okay. Yeah.
I think what they were actually getting to was satanic, and that's the point.
Well, obviously.
And that's the point, is when nations go beyond God's design in the form of empire, what happens then is they usurp the very position of God, and Satan is obviously the author of that, and so that is the thing that brings God's judgment. So when John read from Jeremiah that God has a controversy with all flesh or all the nations, it is because of this phenomena of a revisiting of Babel. I would maintain that there is it's like a genetic memory of Babel in the hearts of all men. And in fact, if we think about it from a biblical perspective or in a more general historical perspective, in every generation there is an effort at reestablishing what Nimrod tried to do at Babel originally. That is to form international units that control as much of mankind as possible. Now today, we have the phenomena of globalism, one world government, one world economy, And that's one of the reasons that we think that we're probably approaching Armageddon very rapidly, is because all of these things are dovetailing into this phenomenon.
That's what we said in the beginning of the program. The United States and Israel and Georgia are aligned in this thing, and Russia's saying, bringing Iran into it. So everything is intertwined. And listen, this is a result of the First and Second World Wars. We really went for the United Nations, the League of Nations, the one world government then in a big time way. And now in our economy with transportation and information flowing across the internet, it's much easier. Supply lines are much greater now.
Global unity is very
achievable in our
achievable.
Day, yeah.
As a matter of fact, even as we speak, I don't know what kind of time of day it is in China. I get confused on that. But the Olympic Games are ongoing currently, and that is a demonstration or a motivation toward global unity in itself. We want to back up a little bit and look at this phenomena as it has occurred throughout the generations, throughout biblical history, and reaching into our own day. I said a moment ago that this phenomena of Babel, this unification of mankind under man's authority, ultimately under satanic authority, in opposition to the stated will of God, is always visible. And if we go back even in the very early stages of biblical revelation, we'll find a sequence of, we call them biblical empires, but they're world empires. We have, for example, the Assyrian Empire. This would be during the days of Isaiah, for example. We have the Babylonian Empire following them in the days of Jeremiah. Following them was the Persian Empire during the days of Nehemiah and Ezra. We have following them the Greek Empire, bringing us down to the time of Jesus, and the Roman Empire. So we have empire after empire after empire following the pattern of Babel, and then following the demise of the Roman Empire. We have what I normally term regional empires competing with one another, ultimately coming, and the most recent in our own lifetime has been we talked about Russia and the United States, the U.S. and the USSR competing for influence. Now, ultimately, the Bible tells us that we're coming down to one world global nation. Bible prophecy, a lot of books have been written about a revived Rome, and I will just make a flat statement. We'll prove it on another program, and that's wrong. It's not a revived Rome, it's a revived Babel. It is truly a global nation that's going to emerge according to the prophecies, in opposition to the stated will of God. Now, because it is a global thing usurping God's position as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and because it is in opposition to the stated will of God, then God's going to bring the hammer on it.
God's going to judge it. And nothing is new. 150 years before Nebuchadnezzar and Jeremiah writes about it, the Babylonian was the Assyrians coming to the northern kingdom, took off the 10 tribes and coming down into Judah. But and so Isaiah writes about that. He's an eyewitness to that one. He writes about the Assyrians, but you see it goes beyond that time period also.
As a matter of fact, he specifically says this is God's plan against all the nations. Read that scripture from Isaiah 14.
We're in Isaiah 14, verse 24. The Lord of hosts has sworn, saying, surely just as I have intended, so it has happened, and just as I have planned, so it will stand, to break Assyria in my land, and I will trample him on my mountains. Then his yoke will be removed from them, and his burden removed from their shoulders. This is the plan devised against the whole earth, and this is the hand that has stretched out against all nations.
Now that's kind of, I'm sorry.
The Lord of hosts has planned it, and who can frustrate it? And as for his stretched out hand, who can turn it back?
Okay.
So nobody's going to stop God. That's what he's saying.
That's absolutely, and so very, very early we have, this, we might call it the plan for Armageddon, because this is the process. This is God's plan against all the nations. So we find that theme very, very consistent throughout Bible prophecy. Now, we want to look at this confrontation, the ultimate confrontation that will lead us to this Armageddon. Now, let me say that in a general sense, the general plan of redemption that we see revealed as we study through the Scriptures ultimately leads to deliverance of the nations from the hand of Satan. Every deliverance starts with a confrontation. We might look at the individual deliverance accomplished by Jesus. There was the Gadarene demoniac, for example. There was a confrontation and then deliverance. Well, there's a confrontation here, and that confrontation is generally known as Armageddon.
So it's going to get darker before it gets light. That's the general what we're saying. And that's the real tribulation.
I hate to hear you talking about that, but you're exactly right.
Yeah.
God will prove the rebellion of the nations against His state. God is now with the ingathering of Israel. God is little by little exalting Israel as a nation in the land, and sooner or later the nations in general won't tolerate it and they'll attack. That's Armageddon.
In the middle of Revelation 15, in the middle of this judgment of the nations, there's a song, the song of Moses and the Lamb. Great and marvelous are his works. Now this confrontation, we're going to back up again. We did Jeremiah's time, Isaiah's time, and we're going back another 250 years to King David's time here. And we're going to read the Psalm 2, the first 4 verses. Why are the nations in an uproar and the people devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed. Let us tear their fetters, and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in heaven, in the heavens, laughs. The Lord scoffs at them, and he will... So, God is not going to be moved at all. This is an ongoing process, and we recorded that it goes all the way back to Babel.
Right.
And so it's ongoing to this day. Nothing has changed. We are of God, little children, but the whole world lies under the power of the evil one.
Let me interject something here, John. Now, on the 2nd of September, we're having our registration for the fall term Zamok Institute, and we'll initiate a new Bible class that's starting in Genesis, works all the way through the Bible, and you'll see these developments in a systematic way. But we're also going to have a course in world history. And our world history course is going to develop that theme very, very directly. It's very, very important that people understand history in this sense. Now, we've been talking about this redemption process and this confrontation that reaches to the ultimate climax in deliverance. Many prophets spoke about it, but specifically we want to look at a couple of them, namely Joel and Zechariah. John, do you have the scriptures in Joel?
Yes, I'm going to read from Joel 3, verse 2. You hear a lot about the land for peace. Israel gives up land and doesn't get any peace, but look what Joel has to say. I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations, and they have divided up my land. So God is specific again And frankly, we as Americans have the most influence with Israel and are dictating to them to trade land for peace. Their secular leaders are willing to do this, and this is in opposition, in rebellion to God's stated plan.
Okay, but obviously, as you say, the leaders of Israel for the past decades have been overly influenced by U.S. foreign policy in dividing up the land. Bought and paid for. My brother used to say in Kentucky that they had the very best politicians that money could buy, and so certainly that's true in Israel too, I believe. But sooner or later, the Israelis are going to overcome this. I believe there's a growing trend of righteousness in Israel.
You've seen those people right on this program.
And they're going to come to a position of leadership, I am absolutely convinced, and they will ultimately reject this and declare God's purpose in His people and His land and bring this thing to an end. When that comes, I think we'll see Zechariah 12 fulfilled, and if you got that scripture, we'll read that, but that says the same thing that Joel did.
Okay, I'm going to read verses 2 and 3. Behold, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the peoples around, and when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. And it will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples, and all who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. Wow, that's pretty severe. All the nations are going to be gathered against it, and they're going to be severely injured because they're dividing Jerusalem.
That's again. Right. That's right. So again, we're coming to this point of climax. Now we want to see if we can help you understand the role of Israel today and the role that we as Christians, believers in Messiah Jesus, have to follow. Now I'm going to tell a story about something that my dad used to participate in that was illegal, but he died several years ago, so I assume nobody's going to attempt to arrest him. When I was a kid growing up in the hill country of Kentucky, every now and then my dad and his neighbors would take a net, a seine, and go down to the local river, and they would pull that net across the river. It wasn't a real large river. And some of the people would get upstream and run down as in the river. It wasn't real deep. Run down the river, scaring the fish, pushing the fish into the net. And so we see Armageddon is very much like that. God has regathered His people in the nations. He is exalting Israel to a higher and higher position of visibility, and obviously with His blessing. And so that serves as like the net. That's like the bait for the nations. The nations are ultimately going to show their rebellion. Now we as Christians, especially as grafted into Israel, scattered throughout the world, our role is to run down the river and scare the fish into the net. And so that's spiritual warfare, and that's our job in the midst of the nations. That's why we're in Castleberry and not in Kedemim tonight or today, whenever.
Or Jerusalem.
Or Jerusalem or wherever. We've been involved a good deal in the community of Kedemim. 50 miles north of Jerusalem or something like that?
Yeah.
So whatever. So we're supposed to be running down the river, scaring the fish. In other words, our job in spiritual warfare is to bring light and understanding to what's happening. And that will provoke the nations.
Ultimately, the nations are going to grow so bold that they're going to attack God's anointed vessel, just as these prophets have said. And then the judgment of all nations will occur. We call it Armageddon. Just like he's going to bring them to His land, He's going to destroy them on the mountains of Israel.
That's what Isaiah said.
Isaiah said that, but Ezekiel gives us the picture of what it'll look like in the valley, in the Jezreel Valley. Now we are, I'm leading a trip to Israel in March of 2009. We're going to stand on the Har Megiddo, overlooking the area where the Armageddon is going to take place, Ken.
It always is always intriguing to me when I have groups there looking over the Jezreel Valley. Almost invariably, we're reading from the book of Ezekiel or the book of Revelation, and a few Israeli jets will go zipping by, breaking the sound barrier, boom, 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 like that, and everybody is ducking and covering their head. And you think Armageddon is in process.
You think
in Israel, there's no law prohibiting their fighter jets from breaking the sound barrier as it is here. So it's quite common to hear that.
Well, it takes them about 2 minutes to get across the whole country. Anyway,
maybe. I don't know if it takes them quite that long. I remember we were on the beach at Caesarea one time, and there were military exercises. And there were Israeli jets flying in off the Mediterranean, extremely low. I mean, these guys must not have been over 100 feet and breaking the sound, and it just scared everyone.
That got you going, huh?
So it's not hard to envision, right, especially there.
Now, Ken, what about the church has assimilated into the nations? We're a Christian nation here in America. Why are we in opposition to God's stated will then? Can there be such a thing as a Christian nation?
Well, I like your statement, John, that you said once before that Israel is the only Christian nation.
Right, that's what we're heading. The only anointed nation, according to my Bible, is Israel, not the United States.
John said all the world lies under the power of the evil one. And tonight, as we've looked at this subject, we hope that we've been able to portray in a realistic manner why that's true. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So he's not against Gentiles, non-Jewish people. He is against the phenomena of Babel that is arising. Now we see it as globalism today, a one world entity merging very, very rapidly, and that's the thing that God has promised to judge.
Now, the absolute biblical truth is there's nowhere you could flee to, because this is going to happen on a global plane. The only place to flee to is to see yourself and be grafted into Israel. That's the proper position for the church today, being grafted into Israel.
John, let me just end tonight by saying that we want to invite you to come out on September the 2nd, Tuesday night after Labor Day, for registration for new classes at the Bible Institute, and we will develop very systematically how these things are revealed in the Scriptures. That's our program for today. Shalom.